Arizona was a territory until 1863, part of New Mexico territory. When it broke, very, very few people here. The population in 1860 was 6,482, with 2,400 Anglos as opposed to native population. If you look at the numbers there, it grew 1870, 4 times between 1870 and 1880, doubled again by 90, and then a significant bump by 1900. Very, very few photographers, very difficult to photograph here. Native Americans, Apaches, and others were active, Mexican bandits and so on were active at the time. So a few photographers came through and made images early on, but not very many. So we're going to start with some of the earliest images, work our way through. This is, in theory, taken from a daguerreotype, in quotes. This is from the Ives expedition, showing a paddle wheel steamer going up the Colorado River, 1858. People saw Arizona through these woodcuts and illustrations that were all filtered through an artist. And the artists were not always totally accurate, so people got bizarre feels of what Arizona was like. This is an example of one of the saguaro cacti images that they used. They put staffage in, you see the small people, that would give a scale for the saguaro cactus, so you get an idea of how large the cacti were. They obviously exaggerated that fairly heavily. And when saguaro cactus died, as you all know, they explode and their ends get frazzled. So this is the kind of images people saw before photography. During this time period, you couldn't put photographs in books or magazines. They were all done in woodcuts or illustrations. So people would see photographs from stereo views, which I'll show you in a few moments, or other formats. But all the popular press and books, Leslie's, other magazines, you'd see illustrations like this. Very difficult for people to get an idea of scale and size. This is one of the Casa Grande, obviously, but if you were back east, had never been to Arizona or the West, had no idea what this was, you couldn't tell if it was this tall or many times that size. So they would put staffage in and put a human figure in. They would do this when people were doing images of Egypt on the grand tours and so on. So there's always somewhere staffage or something in there for scale, an object, a person, something to give an idea of scale. Most of the early images of Arizona were done in stereo format. They were done with a stereo camera. Left eye image, right eye image are separated. You reverse them when you print it, put it in a viewer, and when you view it, your brain fuses those two images together and you see a single 3D image. That was one of the most popular formats for people to see photographs during this time, and there was a major market for selling stereo photographs, so it was an incentive to be able to use. They also were small, light cameras, so they had a very short exposure compared to the larger cameras. And if you're carrying a piece of glass this big for a negative instead of a piece of glass this big for a negative, with all the chemistry and everything else, it was much easier. So many of the images you see are that format. People had stereoscopes and parlor stereoscopes and stereo cards, and as people were coming to Arizona, they would send images back to their friends. If they were doing an investment in a mine, they would get an image of the mine to be able to send back. It was a way to communicate what things looked like in Arizona at the time and to connect with people. So there's a lot of interplay. Most of the stereo images I find are from California, Midwest, East, and other places, not from Arizona, because everybody retired other places or sent things to other places. Very, very few collections here. The earliest images of Arizona, photographic images I've been able to find in any collection anywhere, were taken December 1864. These were done by a gentleman named H.H. Edgerton. He was an engineer from California, and as the Civil War was winding down, they came to Arizona to try and find a way to reopen the mines. There was silver mining in the Spanish era, silver mining in the 1840s and 50s, and it closed down during the Civil War. So they were trying to get here ahead of time to be able to see what they could do to open the mine. This has a group of Native Americans in the background. These are Papago warriors that had come down from Bosque Redondo in the upper corner of the state and were part of this tour. Another image from that series has the mountain man sort of wearing what appears to be a dress, and the two Anglo gentlemen there with somebody in the foreground. This is down at AZPA. And if you can notice, these were done as collodion wet plate negatives. So sheet of glass, flow the collodion on, sensitize it, while it's wet, put it in the back of the camera, photograph it, develop it, fix it, dry it, pack it, and move. I'll show you some examples of the amount of equipment people carried. Estimating it's about 150 pounds of material to be able to go out on a stereo expedition in Arizona during that time. And in many cases, you also had to carry water with you because there wasn't water, fresh water. So it was a pretty excruciating activity. And if you look at the detail, the bottom there is where the collodion is torn and sort of folded up again. They printed it anyway because you couldn't go back and retake these images, and they would typically take the image, take it back to the studio, print in the studio. So this was probably printed back in California. This is the first photo studio in Arizona. This was built in the 1860s in Prescott. It was used by every photographer that came through, Carlos Gentile, Francis Cook, Dudley Flanders, all the photographers that came through Arizona would rent or borrow this space. The thing that's most interesting about it is right here. This is what's called a solar enlarger, and nobody had any idea there was a solar enlarger out in Arizona during this time period. It was a way to enlarge the negatives. You didn't have a regular enlarger, you needed a lot of light. Small negatives were contact printed, and if you want to do an enlargement, it was very difficult to do. Solar enlarger would take sunlight through the negative and enlarge it to make a soft print. They called them crayon portraits. It was not a very sharp image, but you could retouch it or add to it and make it a large format image. And again, without the photograph, there's no evidence, or no one would think of a solar enlarger being used in Arizona during this time period. So finding the photo gives you evidence to change the story. And you can see the area in the top where they used to adjust the light, reflectors and so on inside. But again, this studio was active for many, many years and was used over and over again, and made many of the more interesting images of Arizona were either printed or taken in this location.
Is that building still standing?
No, it's long gone, unfortunately. Most of the images here, you're going to see long gone buildings. That's Arizona in a nutshell, I think, with things disappearing. If you've got questions, this is pretty informal, so just let me know if you've got a question or thought. Carlos Gentile was an Italian rich boy that got run out of Italy for being a little bit wild and crazy. They shipped him off to Canada. He photographed in Western Canada for a period of time. He was doing wet plate photography and washing his plates in a river, and he had the stuff sticking to the collodion wet plate, which was gold. And so he kicked off the gold rush in California at that point, made money, came down to Arizona in 1868, 1871, made photographs here. These are a couple of images that he did. Again, stereo images. The dome top is a trimmed stereo image. And if you look, the two images, they're just slightly different. You can see, if you look at this edge and that edge, it's just a slight difference. That's what your brain uses to fuse those two images together to make a stereo image from that. He did some larger format images as well, but stereo was the format of choice at that point. Another format is called the carte de visite. They're basically this size of a visiting card. And in the mid-1850s, it became possible to make collodion negatives and print on albumin paper, so you can make multiple copies of prints. Daguerreotypes and early processes were all unique images, so you could make multiple copies. Carte de visites became very, very popular end of the 1850s, all through the Civil War. This is a Civil War image that was shot in California at Jacob Schu's studio in San Francisco. The stamp on it is a revenue stamp that they used to generate funds for the Civil War. They taxed photographs, and you had to put a tax stamp on the back of the photographs depending on the value of the photograph. And that also typically is canceled by the photographer. So in pen, it's got the date it was taken, photographer's initials, and so on. Very helpful in identifying the image. This is William Hancock. He was part of one of the California units that was sent to work to fight in Yuma. And then after the war, he stayed here, wound up working as a post trader at Fort McDowell. Then he wound up going to Prescott, came down to Phoenix. He was the surveyor that laid out the Phoenix plot of the street grid and laid out Phoenix, and very, very famous at that level, became an attorney, long history of Arizona. Unpublished image, nobody had ever seen this before. This came out of an album that was found in Montana, bought by a book dealer in California, who was starting to take the album all the way apart. We were able to stop it, get this image, and all the companion images with it. His partner is also in this, as well as family. So there's a really nice family story in this album to try and research. But again, an unpublished image of a very famous Arizona. These are other Arizona carte de visites. The one on the left is Olive Oatman. She was captured, she and her sister were captured when the family was attacked by Apaches in 1851 near Maricopa Wells. And she was traded between various tribes, wound up with the Mojave, and she has the Mojave chin tattoos. She was rescued in 1856. Her sister passed away. Olive was brought back. They have many photographs of her in Anglo attire. She was a very popular subject for other photographs to be made. There was a book about her capture and the rescue of Olive Oatman, so a very famous Arizona-related person during that time. The other image is one of Apache scout. His name was Donald McKay. He was a scout operating primarily out of Yuma during that time period, 1868, very early image. I mentioned the gear. This is the kind of gear that we would have taken with you, a portable darkroom tent to be able to coat your plate and do the work there. You'd have to bring, again, all of your chemistry, all the glass plates that you wanted to operate with, everything. You couldn't go to the store and buy film, cameras, other material. And even finding glass was very difficult. So it's the kind of thing you would have to make a fairly heavy investment. The Wheeler and Powell surveys that I'll show you in a few moments would actually bring things overland from Salt Lake City and meet people at the top of the canyon and carry things up and down the canyon to exchange exposed plates and to get new material, and just very, very complex activity. This is John Hiller's in Utah Territory with his darkroom. The little thing on the top is a portable darkroom tent. He's working on a negative. He's got the camera case and all the material in place there, including a rope for lowering himself up and down and finding the right vantage point to be able to shoot from. This is another image from the Wheeler expedition. This is Fred Loring. He was an artist for Leslie's magazine, and he was doing woodcuts and illustrations and supposed to document the expedition, but between Prescott and Wickenburg, he wound up being killed in a massacre. And so they made a photograph. The photograph of him became very famous, and that drove a lot of interest in Arizona and the Southwest in Leslie's magazine, so they did more following of the expedition than they probably would have done normally. So the images of the Wheeler and Powell surveys that were done 1871, 2, 3, and 4 are the things that really sort of put Arizona on the map. People would buy the stereo views. They would use the stereo views to make illustrations for the periodicals, and people were following the ongoing activity there. This is the Wheeler expedition, which was the engineering expedition that went to the canyon. They left from Fort Mojave and they rowed boats upstream against the Colorado River into the canyon, as opposed to the Powell, which came down the other direction. This is a shot of the 4 boats that they took with all their supplies and so on as they were taking off. This is a shot of one of the boats with the portable darkroom, the black darkroom tent. Sometimes they would do a black tent, sometimes a white tent. It made a lot more sense in Arizona to have a white tent rather than a black tent, but they didn't think about that necessarily when they first got supplies. So you see some of them transition as they work their way through. But again, photochemistry, the dark tent material, cameras obviously up here making the photograph, but an idea of what the expedition looked like. I love the images that are more abstract from that expedition. This is a William Bell image of a rock showing the wear pattern, but again, instead of a human staffage, there's a hat. So the hat gives you a sense of scale, and put that together as a image. Just love these. There's also large format prints. They made some large format images of these also. Another one, I love the staffage with hats and objects. So this is another one, a melon cactus with the battered hat in the corner. So again, if you cover the hat, you couldn't tell from the rocks if those are boulders, and that's big, small, or others. So the staffage was often a big part of it. And again, human scale of the canyon. This is another William Bell image of the canyon showing the scale of the canyon and size, which you wouldn't understand if you just saw the canyon itself. So again, the other expedition was the Powell, John Wesley Powell expedition. He wound up coming from Colorado and north down the Colorado River. So he was the one that flowed with the flow as opposed to going against the flow. He had been shot and wounded during the Civil War and lost part of his arm. And most of the poses that you see, he has his arm tucked away on one side, so you can't see that he's got the missing arm. To go down the canyon with only one arm was very difficult. So they actually took an oak office chair and they tied it to his boat. And if you've ever been in a canoe and stood up and know how the difference between sitting in a canoe and standing in a canoe is, and imagine going down the Colorado in a boat with somebody with a center of gravity that high, total insanity. But they did. They made the images and made it work. He did primarily ethnographic work, so a great series of images of the Paiute and other Native Americans that were there. Many of these are documented. Both Wheeler and Powell had funding each year. So they would get funding for a year, and they would take the stereo views and their images and go back to Congress to get money for the next year. And so it was a tool that they used for funding the expedition.
So these different photographers that are out, do they work with teams? Or are they working alone?
Most of these had a primary photographer and some assistants. Occasionally the primary photographer would leave and an assistant would take over. So there's a listing. I don't have a listing off the top, but there are listings of all of the other photographers that worked on the expedition each year. But it was primarily work of an individual photographer on on these, or one of the other people in the expedition helping. Powell was an entrepreneur as opposed to Wheeler. He actually licensed his images and sold them, and when he got done with the expeditions, he made enough money to buy a home in Washington, D.C. with the revenue he got from selling the stereo views that he made on the expedition. But again, they would use this to go to Congress and battle to see who got the funding. The first photographer that came to Arizona on an entrepreneurial expedition to try and make images of Arizona after that was Dudley Flanders and his partner Henri Penland. Penland unfortunately passed away. He was an artist from California. Both of them were artists from California. They had both been photographers in California, and they decided to come to Arizona in the fall of 1873 to come for 1874 to make images of Arizona to sell. They wanted to document and sort of compete with the expedition images in a way that they thought would be different enough to make money, and they came over. Penland wound up catching the grip and passing away in Prescott early in that cycle in February, and Flanders continued on. They'd already printed the cards, the stereo views and the back marks, Flanders and Penland, and couldn't get any more, so they just kept using those and using those and using those until they got back to California. This is the route that he followed from San Bernardino across through Hardyville, the Hardyville Trail, so through Soda Lake and across Hardyville, then across to Prescott, then from Prescott across to Camp Verde, back to Prescott, down through Maricopa Wells to Tucson, from Tucson to Camp Bowie Apache Pass, then to San Carlos Reservation and back. One really important piece about his work, he was in Camp Verde in the spring of 1874 when they were gathering the Tonto and Yavapai Apache that they're going to take to San Carlos Reservation. And then when he traveled, he wound up going to the San Carlos Reservation as they established them at the reservation in the fall. So it's got sort of the bookends of that San Carlos development that he did. This is a self-portrait that he did in stereo of him with his photographer's wagon with a darkroom next to it, sort of setting up. This is a detail of the wagon with a little white darkroom area in the back and the little tent he would use. You can see the negative he has in a folder there, and just an example of him on the road with his two horses. Interesting enough that nobody seems to pay much attention to is they would not just make stereo views, they would also do slide presentations. So just like this is a slide presentation from the spring of 1874. He would take the negative, contact print the negative to make a positive, and put the positive in a lantern slide and do lantern slide presentations. So he was going through Arizona doing presentations at Maricopa Wells, Tucson. There was no Phoenix to stop at during that time period, but there's a whole series done. This is an example of what the lantern slide projectors looked like at the time. Lit with kerosene, no electricity, so very, very dim, but still something kind of fun. Projectors are called stereopticons. These are stereoscopes, and stereo views are stereographs. Everybody calls these stereopticons, or many people do, and it's a mistake, so trying to correct the vocabulary. This is a shot at the beginning of this trip in Camp Verde, and you can see the little white back of his wagon there. This is a shot of the Yavapai and Tonto Apache being gathered at San Carlos Reservation, I'm sorry, at the Camp Verde Reservation before they shipped them off. This is a Tonto Apache family at the reservation, one of the images that he made. There's about 120 images I've been able to identify titles so far. And there's an orange mount view that are printed in Arizona and yellow mount views that are printed in California, different numbers. I'm a number fanatic on this stuff. You learn a lot about the photographer by putting together collections of their images and looking at how they worked, so trying to get these sequences together is important. This is Elliott's factory, the Arastra and factory in Prescott. It was so, the gold was so rich in Prescott during this time period, people would bring it into the town to have it processed. You wouldn't have to bring ore in, you could just have it, nuggets processed and things there. There's a water tower on the side and a blacksmith shop. This was the shop for all of the mines in the Bradshaws and in the Granite Creek and in that area, until things got big enough that would start separating them and having to do a little bit more work to get the gold out of the mountains. Another Flanders view as he was going down. This is Maricopa Wells. Very famous image. Nobody credits it as being from a stereoscope. Nobody credits it as being a Flanders image. But this is the telegraph station at Maricopa Wells. It's where you would stop on the way down to Tucson. This one belongs to a friend, and I'm waiting for him to pass away so I can get it. It's a Flanders image of the Mexican circus in Tucson. Until you see this, you hear stories about Mexican circuses, and they had Mexican circuses that travel back and forth across the border. You think of them as being something small, tiny, a couple of people performing, whatever. Multiple trapeze, high rear performances, multiple rings, bareback riding, totally insane. Hard idea of spring 1874. There were many of these views that were pirated and copied and put on other mounts. So it was very common for a photographer to make a great image and for another photographer to say, I'd like that image, so they just make a copy of it and sell it. So second, third, fourth generation images come out of this as pirate images. But Flanders in particular was pirated by several photographers in California at the end of his cycle, so you find Flanders images on other mounts. And because the mounts are later, one company was called the Continent View Company. They did views of Prescott 10, 15 years later and copied his images. And the museum at Prescott and the other museums say, oh, well, that image was taken in 1885 when it was taken in 1874. That makes a huge difference in how you interpret the photograph and the information in the photograph. So I'm trying to be a stickler on dates and times.
How did they do the copies?
Just photographic copies. They would just set it up with a camera and make a photographic copy. And as you know, when you copy, you bump contrast and lose sharpness. Some copies are very good, but many are not. And sometimes there's second and third and even fourth generation copies that get really nasty. So it's another way of looking at the sequence of images. This is the Indian school at Santa Fe Mission in Tucson. Sister Hyacinth is one of the sisters there. I've got other photos of her. We've been able to identify her. But this is the kind of thing that he documented. This is the kind of thing you wouldn't have seen in the Wheeler or Powell surveys, but an idea of what life was like in Arizona, the kind of things that you saw as you went through Arizona.
Is there any kind of a record of copies
of,
like if you're looking for these, what the copies are, whether are they original?
I've got examples of the copy mounts. As you look at them, you get an idea of understanding the image quality and being able to tell what the copies look like, so that you can do. As you understand the photographer, you understand more about their mounts and how they printed them and where they might have come and what that time period is. And if the mount's wrong for that time, it's probably a copy. So there are lots of clues. This one's John Clum. He was the Apache agent at San Carlos. This is also a Flanders view. He was basically he was in seminary school. He wound up being a astronomical observer in Santa Fe, and then wound up coming over here as a Indian agent for the San Carlos Reservation. He was very, very human. He was a good person. He handled it very, very well. After he left, there were a lot of problems, but he was pretty solid. And this is a shot that they did of him, wearing the top hat, brand new clothes, brand new rifle, just as he arrived in August 1874. The other thing about this is that you can see there's a backdrop, a canvas backdrop with stands and flooring. Flanders was carrying all that with him as he went along with his wagon with everything else, so he could set up these shots and do portraits as he worked his way around. Some of the other photographers, these are imprints on the back. Many of these carte visites and stereo views have an imprint on the back that was advertising for the photographer. So these are examples of some of the imprints. Henri Penland from California. There's Juan Rodrigo and Adolfo Rodrigo. They had they were partners in the studios in Tucson. Addison Porter had a studio in Tucson as well. C.S. Fly. The C.S. Fly traveling one on the top is from California when he was coming back and forth to Arizona before he had a studio here. So these are other ways to look at it. And you also see manuscript notes on the back sometimes that are helpful in identifying. But if the manuscript's written in ballpoint pen, you take it as a grain of salt because it's added many years later. You always want to look at these and say, are they period? Are they correct? Is it second or third generation person making the notes? And so on. This is Charles Farcio, another photographer that I followed. He did 117 images of Arizona. Basically, 17 of them are large format, 100 of them are stereo. There's an album of his work that surfaced. It was thrown away in Flagstaff, and somebody pulled it out of the dumpster and gave it to the Historical Society there. They gave it to the Historical Society in Tucson. I found it, identified it, and tracked it down, and it's just phenomenal. It's halves of the stereo view with manuscript IDs on the bottom of all 117 images he made. Tombstone, Charleston, McMillan, Millville, Globe, just really beautiful material. This is one of the Huachuca Mountains, of the lumber mills in the Huachuca Mountains that were feeding, the lumber was being used to feed the mining boom in Tombstone and in the area. George Rothrock, who we've been talking about for the headstone and other things, is one of the first images that he took. He was from California, learned photography in California, and came across with William Young in 1876. And this is the ferry boat that you go from California across to Yuma. The opposite side is the Fort Yuma fort. And whether he did this at the time he came over or came back and photographed it, it's sort of a iconic image, metaphorical image of the leaving California, going to Arizona to start his new business. I like cyanotypes. There are a lot of early cyanotypes that were done because it was an easy way to make prints in the field without a lot of other material, and you could carry the chemistry and use regular paper as opposed to bringing albumin paper. Railway construction with Apache workers and Apache and Mojave workers in the foreground. This is the first locomotive going across the bridge from California into Yuma when they built the bridge across the Colorado River there in 1878. You can see all the construction debris there and the folks posed on the sides. They were trying to block the image of the train coming across. The folks didn't want the train to come and were, they actually had the military out blocking, and in the middle of the night they basically ran steam up and came across and snuck it in. It was one of the things that they were trying to get across ahead of time, but this is a continent view. Often these are pirate views, but many of them are good original views, so you just have to be careful with continent views. This is Charles Savage, a photographer from Salt Lake City that came down to Arizona. This is one of the steamboats in dry dock along the Colorado. They would pull them alongside that and then hoist them up on this ramp to be able to do repairs and work on it, and then drop it back into the river. And in the background you can see the newly completed railway bridge in the back. Carlton Watkins, a very famous California photographer, also came across. He did 93 stereo images of Arizona and some large format images. I've got one mammoth plate photograph that he did of Santa Vera Mission. He did a small number of mammoth plates, a number of cabinet cards and smaller images, but primarily stereo views. This is a saguaro cactus bloom that he did in 1881. Most of the images that you see are of Yuma, Fort Yuma, a couple of great images of Tombstone and Charleston, but and a couple of Tucson as well, but a great series. This is Henry Buman. He operated a studio in Tucson. Another California photographer came over in 1874. He bought the Rodrigo studio. He had worked with Flanders while he was there, as did Rodrigo. And then after Flanders left, he bought the studio from Rodrigo. He and his children ran the studio until the 1980s. He had a sort of twisted sense of humor. His last name was Buman. He named his son Al. So we had Al Buman, which was kind of a hoot. Another Rothrock image. Rothrock had an amazing sense of 3D. And I didn't bring this, unfortunately, in 3D, but the way he set people up in the photograph makes an incredible dimensional effect, three-dimensional effect. He was a real master. So his stuff is really, really good. This is a particularly great 3D effect. It's an Apache scout holding an Apache Renegade in the foreground with an officer and his adjutant in the background with the officer's quarters behind that with trees in between. And it just goes on forever. It's a beautiful, beautiful image.
You can almost
yeah, you can almost see it here, yeah. Some people can free view, I can't. You can sort of cross your eyes, loosen your eyes a little bit, and you can actually pop the 3D out of it. But in a stereoscope, it's just amazing. This one has equal 3D effect. It's another Rothrock view. The boy in the foreground wound up being a murderer. The person in the background was the attorney for Phoenix. So it's got a weird story behind it. But the way he placed everybody in this, it also has a really heavy-duty dimensional 3D effect in it. Another photographer, Burge, Joseph Campbell Burge. Most of these people came from California. Another one came from California, learned photography there, and came across and started a business here. He was active in Phoenix, Prescott, Globe, Flagstaff, Kingman. He sort of traveled all over the place. This is a particular studio view that I like. It's an Apache artifact collection that he put together and photographed to sell. So on the back of one of the copies of this card, he was asking $500 for it, and he sent it to a collector in Massachusetts trying to sell the collection. So again, photography was used for documenting investments. A lot of photographs from Arizona were found in places like Kansas, because Kansas was the trail down here, and there were banks in Kansas that would invest in Arizona. We found great material in Amsterdam because there were a lot of European investors in the mines in Arizona. back east, they would send photographs. And I've got one cabinet card of a mine that was obviously a fake, but they've got the guy, owner of the mine, sitting on a horse very proudly with a stack of ingots about like this beside it. And you've got an arrastra, you've got a 2-stamp mill, you've got all the very processes all crammed in this one shot that he obviously sent back saying, you know, look at all I'm doing, give me all the money to do this, and total vaporware. So it's kind of fun looking at that side. This is Ben Wittick, another very famous photographer. He came from New Mexico across. This is a shot up in Painted Desert, the Punch Bowl Rock, with a gentleman, the agent, he was the railway agent, Pilchner, is in Wilcox image that he shot on his route. He also did larger format images with A.F. Randall. They did the Randall and Wittick images. There's a series of probably 40, maybe 50. I haven't gotten a full count of these because they keep popping up. The ones in gold border were the presentation set, the ones without the gold border aren't. But this whole series of Apache and Mojave in the Fort Apache area. These are boudoir cabinet cards, this larger, the larger size mounts. Beautiful tonality when they're right. And they worked as a team so much that you really can't tell who did what. You see some images that are marked Wittick, some mark Randall, some mark Randall and Wittick. The studio props exchange between them. So whether they were making one set of negatives and sharing them back and forth, we don't know. Another weird one, I picked this up within the last year. That's just we saw this at George Chamberlain's bookstore in Scottsdale about 25 years ago. And it was supposed to be sold to a friend of mine on Tuesday because they were closed on Monday. George was in paying a bill on Monday and somebody came in and saw it and bought it. So my friend didn't get it. He's been trying to find it forever. I finally surfaced and I got it. It's a large format, beautiful embossed mount. Joseph Goldwater, one of the Goldwater family, was a little bit of a crook. And when San Francisco bought a bunch of supplies, about $60,000 worth of supplies, had them shipped and never paid for them. And so they were trying to track him down. And this is the posse that was put together to try and track down Joseph Goldwater because they had extradition papers and warrants issued for his arrest in San Francisco. It's completely ID'd on the bottom, manuscript on the back, description. It's just a really cool piece of history. Another cyanotype, unfortunately unknown photographer, but just a beautiful cyanotype of White House at Canyon de Chelly. Again, the kind of thing that you see. Many unidentified photographers did work in Arizona, beautiful work in Arizona. Mostly professionals or semi-professionals during this era. Then it becomes snapshots, vernacular, and amateur after Kodak came out with the string set #1 and #2, and then postcard era. Have to talk about Fly briefly, C.S. Fly, Camillus Fly. Whether he did all the work or not, nobody knows. His wife was also a photographer many years after he passed away. This is one of the images from the series that he took in 1886, the capture of Geronimo. And this one is, I find it more interesting than the other ones. This is Charlie McComas. He was a young white boy that was captured and held captive by the Apache for 3 years, from 1883 to 1886. And they rescued him at this point and photographed him in situ as they were, for the rescue. Probably a prop shot that they set up and did, but an example there, but showing the Apache area with the copyright notification for Fly on the bottom. Many, many fake flies. Somebody actually made a CS Fly imprint for the cabinet cards that he could use to dampen the cards and emboss them to make them look like they were done by Fly. As soon as they get worth a certain value, you start seeing fakes, unfortunately. A couple more cabinet cards. The one on the left is Frank Hartwell, who we did the headstone for before. That's the image, the self-portrait we used for that headstone. On the right is George Rothrock, the one that I'm hoping we can use on the next headstone. They would do individual portraits themselves, sometimes for tests in the studio, sometimes otherwise, but a couple of photographers there. More cabinet cards. This is portrait of mother and child, sort of an unusual shot. Often they would shoot the back of a woman's head to show her hairstyle, but this one is done to show the child. And so just an interesting composition there. The other one is another Rothrock image. That's George. In 1893, he had a Tempe studio very briefly. So we can date that as 1893. That's him with his bicycle, and the little box is one of his Kodak camera boxes, so we could take his Kodak camera in the field as he went around. A couple more cabinet cards, muscle builder at Fort Grant, and the largest cactus in the world. which kept shifting. They would find a large cactus, and it would be the largest cactus in the world until it fell over, and then the new largest cactus in the world. This was published by Tabor in California, but probably shot by Rothrock here. Boudoir cabinet card, another Henry Buman. He came up to Silver King and documented Silver King. Really great series there. So booming town of Silver King that's all gone now. And interior of the machine shop at Silver King, showing the occupational things. He did a whole series of about 12 boudoirs at that point. Another Rothrock to get you in the Rothrock mood. This is the Salt River in 1891 when the Salt River flood. And the water is so high that it's literally bank to bank in the Salt River. It washed the railway bridge away, so you can see the railway bridge gone. And if you look very closely up here, in the middle of the river, you've got all the people from Tempe came out to watch the guys making the pictures on the other side. In the middle of the river, with the bridge just having washed away. But totally crazy. But anyway, just a beautiful image there. This one for the photographers is kind of fun. It's a letterpress printed card for this photography studio. On the top it says, "Very truly yours, age 35, Christmas 1896." But in the bottom, printed in the corner, "All negatives carefully destroyed. The only gallery lighted exclusively by lurid bonfires. Aristo, Platino, Allegretto, and any old thing," for the kind of paper that they used. "Anesthetic supplies for painless photography of imprints, and possibly no operators employed over 10 years of age." So they took a little bit of time to make this printed mount to put this thing on as a gag. Some more boudoir cabinet cards. These are Yuma, taken by Elias Bonin, another photographer that did a lot of work here. He had a studio in Pasadena and went back and forth. This is the prison, Yuma, from the prison looking out towards Yuma Territorial Prison, interior without people, interior with people. So kind of an interesting sequence of images. I mentioned the Kodak before. The Kodak number 1 and number 2 were circular string set cameras. You'd buy the camera with a film in it, take the pictures, send it to Kodak, have them process it. They'd take the film out, and then they would put new film in and send you the pictures back. These are number 2s. Number 1s are small, number 2s are slightly larger. These are number 2 Kodaks. I've got probably 4 or 5 albums of number 1 and number 2 Kodaks of Arizona. They're just killer. The thing that's exciting about these to me is they had no viewfinder. On the top of the camera, it had 2 little lines on the top, and you'd have to set up and shoot. People had never taken photos of these before, so these are all as vernacular as you could get. I mean, just people reacting and holding the camera up and doing things. And some of the compositions are crazy. Some of them are just magnificent. So very, very cool stuff. Arizona Falls on one side, and pre-development Camelback Mountain in the background with a saguaro cactus in the foreground. 2 more cabinet cards real quickly. One on the right is another Kodak number 2 with someone who actually caught the trotting horse in motion, which was fairly unusual, and then they printed it that way because they were so excited about it. And then just Rhodes photography. Rhodes is buried at the base of the butte in Tempe where the water towers are at the Broadway curve. So another possible target for us if we're interested in carrying on any memorial for these guys. Photo studio facade. This is a printed imprint on the back, but it shows the 2 photographers with their cameras. I have photos of them with that camera on the bottom of the Grand Canyon with their feet in the Colorado River with their pants rolled up with this 20 by 24 view camera in the background. But this shows what the photo studios in Phoenix would have looked like at that time. This Messenger and Altenburg. This is overview of the mines in Congress, the A-frame and the mine, another boudoir cabinet card, possibly Messenger and Altenburg, not positive on this one. Albumin print, the kind of thing that you see. This one's mounted in a photo album, so it's a little bit funky around the edges, but this is the Ellison Ranch, which is out by Young. There's a small album. I believe these were done by the daughter as a female photographer. I'm still trying to identify that. There's a small batch of those out, but just a great Arizona cowboy scene. This, I believe, is Altenburg, very similar to the other with, I think this is probably shot in either edge of Paradise Valley or edge of Papago Park, and they just put the signs up, so it's shot in the Phoenix area as opposed to where this is going. Very, very rare bicycle. This is actually a shaft-driven bicycle instead of a chain-driven bicycle because it was easier to keep dirt and dust out of. The thing in the back, below the seat, Could be a tripod, could be a rifle. The thing underneath could be a camera, could be not. It's got a very expensive light on the front. Just kind of a fun image, but it's part of an album that Altenberg put together and put a letterpress on the bottom. And a couple more quick ones. So we do another boudoir. This is a wreck of the Maricopa and Phoenix Railway outside of Tempe. Kind of things that would document public events, activities, and so on, both for the railway company, for insurance, and people who were interested in these things. Getting to the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, amateur photography, snapshot photography became much easier to do things. These are cyanotypes that were done by Joe Mora, who lived with the Hopi in 1903, 4, 5, I believe it is. He lived with them and made these postcard-sized snapshots and did a series of images. They're beautiful quality of many of them, but these are all done as cyanotypes. Another one of the images that he did. Ben Wittick also did images like this, but up until the teens, when they sort of went overboard, many, many photographers made these images of the Hopi ceremonials during that time. Cole brothers, need to talk with them real briefly also. About 1903, 1904, came to the Grand Canyon, started making images there, taking boats up and down the canyon, making stereo views, other photographs, and so on. And then they became famous for these shots of the trail. They had their studio over the trail. You'd stop as you're going down on the trail, have your photograph made, go down and come back, and they have the photographs ready to sell to you so you could buy a remembrance of your trip down the canyon. Curtis, need to mention Curtis. I've got one Curtis gravure here. This is one of my favorites. He did the North American Indian series, photographed in Arizona. Volumes 1, 2, and 11 are all Arizona material. I'm sure you'll probably talk, Richard may talk a little bit more about that. If not, we can talk about it another time. But this is one of his Yabishi dancers. Some of these are really great, abstract, wonderful images. Postcards kicked in at that point also, amateur photography and amateur postcards. And professional photographers did postcards as well as amateurs doing postcards. This is the Phoenix Drug Company's postcard store, showing how many postcards they sold at the time. It was also very common at this point to take an 1898 photograph of Colonel Poston and make a 1908 postcard of it. So you get the same image showing up over and over again. If it was an important image, they would reproduce it as a postcard. These were done by Hartwell, and there's about 220 Hartwell images that the Berryhill Company bought after he passed away and made postcards. So I'm trying to get that list filled out also. I just love these sort of weird ones. This is a real photo postcard of the proposed bridge at Yuma. And they took India ink and drew the bridge in India ink on the negative, so they print it. And sort of metaphorically, they've got the old ferry boat on the bottom. This is what many people lived in Phoenix at the time. You'd have a temporary summer home, or you'd rent a place like this at the foot of Camelback Mountain or whatever. They'd have, the flaps would open for an Arizona room so you could sleep there, and they'd drop back down if you needed the warmth. And you can see the Oya. You'd wet an Oya, put the water into cool water, and this is where you'd rent before the Biltmore. You'd have a place that you could rent, or you'd buy a place like this where your home was being built. This one's the stagecoach that went from Roosevelt, Arizona to Mesa and back, and carried men and materials, small materials, and payrolls and things back and forth. The building in the back, I don't know if you can quite read it, it's the post office and the Arizona Souvenir Picture Company. The Arizona Souvenir Picture Company had a photo studio in the post office. And I've actually got one of the pictures that they printed. They postmarked it by mistake on the negative, so they printed the negative at the postmark on the bottom of the photo. Really cool stuff. It was operated by, what's her name, Drusilla Burtis, the wife of the postmaster, ran the photo studio there. They did all the photographic work for that area, and you had Charles Lupkin that did the main photography of the Bureau of Reclamation there. But this was the amateur stuff, the more fun stuff that was done at the time. And they would use either red India ink or black India ink on the top to identify their photos. This one's a real fun one for me. One of my two favorite images. This one's just a wonderful street shot of Ray, Arizona with a billiard parlor at the end. Composed a little bit differently than you see most of the photo studios or most of the photographers taking work like this. It's set up a little bit differently. I think the reason he did it is this is why. He printed it upside down as an abstract image with it mirrored, and the way it lines up, it looks like it was done on purpose. I'd never seen anything like it, but you find these really wonderful, weird, abstract things as you look for vernacular stuff, as Richard and many of you know. And every once in a while you find something and then find the source or the pieces that led to it or other things that they did around it. This one's major event in Phoenix, February 1910, the Phoenix Aviation Meet. It's a Curtiss biplane racing the white touring car, which is the fastest car they had in Phoenix at the time. And this was done by Harrigan and Christie, who was a small studio that did work for the newspapers and others as they were around. This one was done by Richard Turnbull, Hispanic photographer. This is the Adams Hotel. There's a shot of it before it burned down here. The original Adams Hotel when it was going up in smoke. And I like finding series and sequences that people did. Here's another image from that fire sequence, just a really wonderful graphic image of the turret, which acted like a flue. I mean, it couldn't have been built to burn better. And when it finally burned, it just really took the whole place out. This is one of two cards that I found. I found one of them in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and the other one here. I just showed one of them. This is the funeral of Prince. These are all of the major factors, the mayor, the lawyer, the major attorneys, the publisher of the paper, and so on, from the tombstone epitaph. That's Prince the dog that passed away. And they claimed that he was poisoned by their competitor. And so there's this whole routine about the prospector's funeral and how they were mourning the bad paper having poisoned their poor dog. They've got Arizona beer bottles in the corner. They've got all sorts of things. The other image is them kneeling. And I'd found the one image. I had no idea there was another image, and I found the second image. So got to be a third out there somewhere. So C.S. Fly, again, this is C.S. Fly's studio burning in Tucson, Tombstone, done as a real photo postcard by Mrs. Fly as she left when the studio was on fire. 3 shots were made at the time. Probably all 3 of them are unique. I've got one of them, but showing how quickly things burn and craziness there. Arizona history documented very heavily here. This is the Bisbee deportation in July. Sorry, there's a typo in my notes here, but July 1917, there were union organizers trying to organize the union, and the mines and the government were against the union. They had union organizers that came out from the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, and there was a major conflict. So in July 17th, in the middle of the night, they deputized a bunch of people. They have white armbands and rifles. They went door to door and took all the pro-union people at gunpoint, herded them from Bisbee to Lowell to the baseball stadium, kept them under guard in the baseball stadium so they could get a train there, and then loaded them at gunpoint on the train, took them to the middle of the desert in New Mexico and dumped them, 1,100 people. And the mine doesn't like this. Mining companies went around and bought as many copies of the postcards and photographs as they could. They've been destroying them for the last 80-odd years. And probably in 88 or 89, there was an exhibit from the Smithsonian coming through that had one of these in it. And we were able to make sure that it was shown down there. And when they had the opening, you had, even still, there was an aisle in the middle, and there was the pro-union people or pro-mining people on one side and the pro-labor and the other people on the other side down there. It's still really strong, but important documents. And again, wonderful amateur work, wonderful vernacular work. This one I wrote on the blog before. This is done with a Kodak autographic camera. It's the camera, this little trap door in the back, and you flip it up, and there's a piece of the backing of the paper has carbon paper underneath it. So you can write on it, and the carbon paper transfers to the negative. And when you process the negative, it's clear. So it's black, so it prints white on the print. They made 2 rolls of film. Clay was there. I've got 3 of the shots from those 2 rolls of film now. But again, amateur shot, autographic shot, and interesting example there. This one's showing the post office and the impact of rural farm delivery and postal history and postcards and so on, and how much material people would carry. This is the post office at Ganado with a Model T that's looking like this. The frame's already bent. This is Christmas load that they were taking out to do a delivery. And again, just sort of a fun amateur shot. Buffalo soldiers are important back in the Indian War era and in the Mexican Border War. This is a shot of some wounded Buffalo soldiers during the Mexican Border War down by Fort Huachuca being carried by an ambulance. Another postcard to give you an idea of another thing. These are unidentified photographers. I've got one more identified in a minute. or 2 more identified in a minute. Chuckawalla Slim, the rockologist. This was set up at Papago Park. He sold jewelry and crafts and whatever out of the back of a variety of cars from the 19-teens, 1920s, up into the 1960s, I believe. I bought something from him in Prescott when I was a kid, so he was around that long. And I've got a whole series of images by and about him. I mentioned Turnbull before. Before Photoshop, photographers would do things like stripping negatives and doing interesting prints. This is Turnbull with a hand-crank motion picture camera taking a movie of himself. Really amazing quality of work that he did. Another just sort of fun image, unidentified photographer, the motorcycle delivery boys for the Phoenix Gazette. Last image I have is Ben Cooley, another gentleman I've been collecting and doing work on, with his large format camera up by the Superstitions to give you an idea of the kind of things people would do. Looks like it's a Kodak number 2D 8x10 with the large additional back and Super Duty tripod on it. That's what I've got for the good of the cause. So any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay.